China's negative public image and how that benefits America. That's the topic of today's Bold and Blunt, and I'm your host, Cheryl Chumley, giving you a Christian conservative look at today's news, politics, culture, and events. And frequent listeners to Bold and Blunt know that in recent times especially, I have had several guests on talking about the perils of China, the perils specifically to the future of American liberties due to the oncoming influence of China around the world and on American soil. But guess what? China, it seems, has such unfavorable views around the world that actually they're not as powerful, as influential as some say. That's what's going to be discussed today on Bold and Blunt. And before I get into all that, I want to quickly mention, if you like Bold and Blunt, you can get Bold and Blunt at edify.app. That is the online platform for faith-based podcasts. You can also get Bold and Blunt at washingtontimes.com. Just go to washingtontimes.com, scroll to the bottom of the page, click on the newsletter section, find my name, my section in that newsletter section, click on it and sign up to get my 3 times a week newsletter at the Washington Times. Contains all my commentaries that I write all week, all day long at the Washington Times, and my twice weekly Bold and Blunt podcast. And one more quick note, you can get Bold and Blunt actually anywhere you get your podcast. Spotify, just go to Google and type in Bold and Blunt podcast. You'll see. Negative views of China tied to critical views of its policies. That is the headline from a Pew Research survey published June of 2022. And it goes like this. Large majorities in most of the 19 countries surveyed have negative views of China. But at the same time, relatively few say bilateral relations are bad. So China has a PR problem, but still people are doing business with China. It's the human rights that really nag at the world's powers. The human rights in China, which are to say non-existent in many instances, particularly for the religious types, but that is one of China's biggest PR problems among the governments of the world. And let me read you a bit right from this survey. Across the nation surveyed, a median of 79% consider these policies, in reference to China's human rights policies, a serious problem, and 47% say they are a very serious problem. Among the 4 issues asked about, also including China's military power, economic competition with China, and China's involvement in domestic politics in each country, more people label the human rights policies as a very serious problem than say the same of the others. Still reading from this Pew finding. Unfavorable views are also closely related to concerns about China's military power, something that a median of 37% say is a very serious problem. Worries are particularly acute among China's neighbors, especially Japan, 60%, Australia, 57%, and South Korea, 46%, though nearly half in some non-geographically proximate countries like Spain, 47%, and the Netherlands, 46%, also feel this way. Economic competition with China is seen as a less serious problem, and that's why governments of the world continue to do business with China, no doubt. A median, that was me, not Pew. Now back to Pew. A median of 30% describe it as very serious. And outside of Israel, it is not seen as the top problem among the 4 tested in any of the 19 countries. So since 2020, Pew found negative views of China have skyrocketed. Well, that makes sense because that coincides with COVID, right? And yet, China still, to many, is the biggest threat to America's liberties, to America's ability to stay dominant on the world stage, to freedom and the ideals of freedom everywhere. My guest today has studied this issue, studied the growing influence of China, and has some interesting thoughts about whether China will be able to pivot from this poor PR rating to enact its global visions of dominance, also called One Belt, One Road Initiative, and become sort of the go-to of governments of the world, taking the place of America eventually. And guess what? It may not be as bad as we all think about China. True, China is a big threat, but China may be crumbling on its own dictatorial, tyrannical, communist system from within before it's able to become the next America to the world. Its own communism, its own stifling of freedom and free thought may actually be what brings China down in the end. My guest today, Josh Kurlantzick, has spent a lot of time researching and studying this issue, and he has a new book out, Beijing's Global Media Offensive, China's Uneven Campaign to Influence Asia and the World. And he's here today to discuss some of his very interesting findings. Josh, thank you so much for being on Bold and Blunt. I really appreciate your time.
Thanks for having me.
So you have this new book out about China, and what really grabbed my attention is that you explore how China is infiltrating the media to spread its principles. Could you explain?
I think that China has been engaged in a massive, it's not just the media, but China has been engaged in a massive influence campaign over the last 10 years, including expanding its state media, trying to control the Chinese language media in most countries in the world, which it has been very successful, including the United States, where Chinese speakers and readers have almost no access to independent coverage of China. It's been expanding its actual paying of politicians in certain countries. Those are the kind of old-fashioned influence efforts. And it's been expanding its efforts to wield power through information and disinformation on social media platforms. But all of this ties back to a bigger trend, which I discussed in the book, which is just that China always had some interest in interfering in other countries' domestic politics and societies, or other places like Taiwan, etc., and in near neighborhood. But in the last 10 years, it has more extensively focused on, and it's dramatically shifted to trying to meddle in the domestic politics and societies of a much larger range of countries, including powerful liberal democracies that China just didn't have the ability to meddle in so effective. Well, actually, I argue that they're only modestly effective, but that they didn't have the ability to meddle in the past. So that includes the United States, Europe, Australia, New Zealand, Japan, South Korea, Canada, basically like most of the major powers in the world. And that's a huge shift from where China was 10 or 12 years ago, where they didn't have the tools, and they were frankly reluctant to, before Xi Jinping openly meddled through state media and controlling Chinese language media, and more clandestinely meddle through a much more expanded range of influence operations in not only in liberal democracy, but a lot of it has been focused on liberal democracy.
So do you attribute the reasons for this switch in the last decade just to the leadership in China? You also made reference that they now have tools that they did not have prior to a decade ago.
I think there are several factors. One is definitely the shift in leadership, where Xi Jinping is just the most assertive and powerful Chinese leader since Mao. And he's the first Chinese leader since Mao to openly embrace the idea that China has a model of development. That model has been, has been severely dented by the last 3 years of disastrous zero COVID policies. But before that, he was promoting the idea that China had a model of development that was superior to liberal democracies. China may have already thought that, but he was the first to promote that. So that's the second part of it. The third part is, yes, China has more tools. China They've spent tons of money on their own state media, etc. The fourth factor is that Xi Jinping is, as you know, extremely nationalistic and fairly xenophobic, and he feels that, and other Chinese leaders feel that, for decades, Western countries, or let's say just say liberal democracies, dominated what they call, and I call in the book, discourse power. Like, most of the major media organizations in the world that kind of shape narratives about things that happen are based in liberal democracies. So that, MSNBC, Fox News, the New York Times, the Washington Times, the Washington Post, the Nikkei, Le Monde, whatever, the Telegraph, the BBC, you could, a whole range of them. And they felt that most of those organizations portray China in a bad light. Now, those organizations aren't designed to portray China in a bad light. They're just doing independent coverage of China, and the fact that China has so many problems, ranging from, massive human rights abuses to total economic coercion of other countries and hyper-aggressive diplomacy and all these things. The BBC and other outlets, the BBC, the New York Times, whatever, the Nikkei, the Fox News, the Wall Street Journal, they don't have a mission to undermine China. It's just producing independent reporting, and that independent reporting in itself makes China look bad because China's doing bad things.
Right.
So Xi Jinping wanted to expand China's state media and make them legitimate state competitors for the prominent Western media outlets, or let's say liberal democracy media outlets. I don't think they've been very successful in that, and that's partly because the last 2 years have been just utterly disastrous from China's global image. And polling by organizations like the Pew organization and other reputable pollers show that China has the most negative public image, and not only in prominent liberal democracies where you would expect that, but also even in places where countries were historically more favorable to China, like in parts of Asia, etc.
So would you say, or did you find in your research, that America has underestimated the threat of China, assuming the sort of dominant platform on the world stage, or have we been fighting it, just not very successfully?
Well, I don't think China, let's just step back. I don't think China's assumed the dominant platform. Part of my book is that they have totally undermined themselves the last 3 years, and their state media has only been, some of their state media has been very effective, like Xinhua, which is their state news wire, which is increasingly being picked up by news outlets and like a regular news wire, which is very dangerous. Some of their other state media has not been so effective. They've had mixed success. So I wouldn't say that they're dominating platforms around the world. I mean, they're still they don't control the global media discourse still to the extent of the major media outlets based conservative, liberal, whatever, based in the United States and other liberal democracies, but China is becoming more successful. Sorry, long-winded answer. To get to your question, I think before 2015, 2016, there was an underestimation of some of these efforts by China for a range of reasons. I mean, it had been policy throughout a whole series of U.S. Administrations, both Republican and Democratic. So, first George H.W. Bush, Bill Clinton, George W. Bush, they all thought that by China continuing to become more prosperous, that somehow this was going to lead to a more open society, and it really didn't.
Right.
And President Obama also continued in that vein, although he wasn't so focused on China perhaps as George W. Bush. But then you had a shift. I mean, first of all, people were talking more about Russia in 2016, 2017, 2018, as well as the U.S. was consumed by our began to be a shift in the Trump administration towards, and I should say also that China is really probably the last bipartisan area of consensus in probably all of U.S. politics, or at least U.S. foreign policy. You have both Republicans and Democrats who have extremely tough views on China. And that includes the current, although she's not going to be the Speaker of the House in a couple of days, but Nancy Pelosi, who has been one of the biggest China hawks for decades, whatever else you think of her. So I think it started with the Trump administration beginning to reevaluate some of these aspects, and that was clearly enunciated in the national security strategy that was put out in 2018 that China is really the major power that, not that Russia shouldn't be focused on. Russia is engaged in a war in Ukraine right now, but and then the Biden administration has not really changed much of Trump's policies, frankly, and there are a huge number of Democrats, in addition to many Republicans, who are extremely hawkish on China. I could give you a whole list, but it is really the last area of bipartisan consensus. Until Biden has continued and actually amped up some of the policies, like the Biden administration passed a law that's extremely restrictive that basically tries to keep China from getting any advanced semiconductors, which is a very, very tough law. Most of the Trump policies on China and other areas, too, like a lot of the restrictions on trade and much greater scrutiny of Chinese investment in media and information in the U.S., forcing Chinese media outlets to register as agents of foreign influence, and the Biden administration is going to come to some conclusion at some point about TikTok, which is indeed like one of the most popular, if not the most popular, social media platform in the world now, but is half controlled by a Chinese state company, and is definitely can't be trusted. I mean, people's data shouldn't be trusted on TikTok. So Trump was trying to negotiate TikTok being sold in the U.S. to various number of buyers. At one point, it was Walmart. I don't really remember. Maybe Microsoft wanted to buy at one point. It didn't work out, but Biden is definitely going to continue to follow through on that. I see in the next couple of years, either TikTok gets banned in the U.S. or the administration forces, like Trump was trying to do. And I think Trump would have done it. He just kind of ran out of time. Forces TikTok to be divested to an American ownership and so that all TikTok servers would be kept in the U.S. So therefore, your data would not be able to be seen by any Chinese entities, and or the Chinese government, and teenagers could enjoy their TikTok at their leisure without worrying about the Chinese government spying on them. So I mean, it's not only teenagers. I just have a teenager. He's desperate to get on TikTok.
Yes, everybody under the age of 20, it seems, wants to go viral on TikTok. So,
I don't even understand. I'm 46, so I haven't let him do it yet.
So, it's optimistic to hear you say that China is the last area in U.S. politics that is really bipartisan. But at the same time, there are a lot of criticisms about this current Joe Biden administration, and it's all in full steam ahead for the green climate change policies, which a lot of critics of that point to China as being the big beneficiary. Could you speak to that?
No, I don't think that's accurate. I'm sorry. I mean, I know the Washington Times is a conservative publication, but I don't think that's accurate.
And why not? Because
most of that money is going to be spent in the U.S. It's not going to be spent in China. There's absolutely no way. Think about it. And in fact, European countries are complaining about that most of the subsidies are going to be spent in the U.S., and they're our allies. world able to make the highest level silicon chips, which in itself is bizarre. And then 90% of those chips are produced by Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Corporation on the island of Taiwan. So, which is great for Taiwan, but, is a little bit precarious given the situation around Taiwan. So, not only has Biden signed legislation basically banning China from accessing the most sophisticated chips in the world, and he's forcing our allies to comply, which they're not happy about. He's also spending tons of money to get Taiwan Semiconductor and other major chip fabricators like Samsung to produce their chips in the United States in a kind of inshoring. They're building plants in the Southwest, etc., so that, and in the horrendous potential scenario that China attacks Taiwan, the United States will still be supplied with semiconductors. Also, I'm not trying to sound like like some huge defender of the Biden administration. The Biden administration is trying to sign an agreement with this Dutch company, with Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing, that they will provide nothing to China, no advanced semiconductors. And in terms of the Green New Deal, no, I don't agree with that. I mean, U.S.-China relations are so bad right now, and that there is just no way that Biden is going to approve, as it is right now, significant sums of funds going to fund green energy in China. And China itself, remember, we haven't even talked about this, is in utter chaos. So they're not really focusing on anything right now except crushing protests, and they need to end opening up from their completely disastrous zero COVID strategy, and they're going to wind up with quite a lot of COVID infections as a result, because they just opened up with no preparation and no plan at all. So, sorry, I gotta disagree with that one.
So let me ask you this final question, because do you have time for one more question? I know
Sure.
Okay, let me ask you this final question. China wants to become the dominant technology force in the world, and they don't have concerns, as America does, about constitutional civil liberties protections. They can basically have a surveillance state which, scoop up data, which feeds the artificial intelligence beast. So do you see that America can win this AI battle, this technology battle, or are we doomed to lose to a regime like China?
No, like I just said, I don't think we're doomed to lose. First of all, China has no ally. They have a bunch of, except North Korea. They have a terrible image in the world today. They have a huge lending program, the Belt and Road Initiative, but that led to all sorts of problems. China is not popular. Yes, they have a number of countries where they've, just the authoritarian countries where they've made sort of partnerships, but their technology, in terms of the most advanced, there are some areas where they have made progress, probably ahead of the U.S. Electric vehicles, maybe, although Tesla is probably a China is going to be set back years, if not decades, in its quest to build some of the most advanced machines in the world because of this, and other reasons. They've also alienated some of these countries too. So finally, I mean, I think it's very hard to develop the most advanced technology industry in the world in an authoritarian state simply because you are often alienating the types of talent that you need to produce the groundbreaking companies. China actually produced some groundbreaking companies, Alibaba, Tencent, and others, but Xi Jinping is strangling those countries, those private sector, legitimately private sector companies. He actually, in order to spend more money on state and frankly on non-money making state-owned enterprises. In addition, the 3 years of zero COVID, the weak economy in China, and just the overall malaise exacerbated by the protests. I mean, there's been a lot of media coverage of this. And the fact that there's unemployment for young Chinese graduates is really, really high. They're going to lose out on their next generation of talent, the type of people who could have, who come to the U.S. or come to Singapore or come to the U.K. or whatever, Canada or other liberal democracies where they're given the freedom and also the capital investment and without much of the hand of the state to pursue new and novel technology companies. China did do that for a little while, but she has crushed that initiative. So, all of these young Chinese graduates could be the next the Chinese Elon Musk or whatever, Sergey Brin or, you know what I mean, Mark Zuckerberg or
right,
whatever. There's a million different examples I could give. They're not going to be able to, and liberal democracy and the capital investment available in liberal democracy without the heavy hand of the state just simply provides for a better environment for the development of technology companies, some of which, because the technology industry is so cyclical and new powerful companies emerge all the time, it's just very hard for China to recreate that. They did do it for a little while, but she has crushed that. And so I actually expect massive emigration of some of China's greatest young technology talents. And that's going to, in addition to all these restrictions on what technology they can access from other countries, it's going to be a huge, maybe even mortal blow to many of their technology industries.
Well, that's some good news for America. And I really appreciate you presenting a different perspective on China. What's the name of your book, Josh?
It's called Beijing's Global Media Offensive, and you can buy it on Amazon right now, and then we'll have a global release in other places in March.
Well,
and thanks so much for having me.
Your book sounds very interesting. I hope people pick up a copy. I do appreciate you presenting a different view on China. Thank you for being on Bold and Blunt, and happy holiday season to you and your family.
All right, you too. Take care.
All right, the book once again is Beijing's Global Media Offensive, China's Uneven Campaign to Influence Asia and the World. Available now on Amazon and in the coming year around the globe. If you like Bold and Blunt, I want to remind you can get Bold and Blunt at edify.app. That is the online platform for faith-based podcasts, or of course directly at washingtontimes.com. Thank you for listening. Tune in next time, and in the meanwhile, stay blunt, stay bold.